For what could be more compelling than to watch at first hand the probable wreck and dissolution of an entire family's fortune? Mr. Bennet refused to gratify his neighbours by displaying any obvious disappointment at the cruel trick of fate which had deprived his dependents of the security he had once so confidently expected them to enjoy. To the world at large, he remained what he had always been, detached, amused, and apparently resigned to an outcome it was not in his power to change. To his family themselves, he seemed barely more concerned. Perhaps in the long hours he spent in his library, he wrestled with himself to find an answer to their plight. If so, he shared neither his anxieties nor his conclusions with them. His wife, however, had none of his restraint. Mrs. Bennet thought of little else but the hardships which lay in store for herself and her daughters when Mr. Bennet was dead, and she was often heard lamenting the wickedness of the entail, both at home and abroad. Her nerves, she declared, were not equal to the strain placed upon them by such an unfortunate business. How anyone could have had the conscience to entail away an estate from their daughters she did not profess to understand. But unless something was done about it, ruin must engulf them all. She was a woman of no great intelligence and small imagination, but she possessed considerable powers of energy and application, which she devoted with all the tenacity at her command to find a solution to their predicament. She was soon persuaded that there was only one answer to the miserable situation in which her girls were placed. They must marry as quickly and as advantageously as possible. If their father could not secure his daughters' futures, they must look to a husband to do so. To have seen her daughters married to men of merely respectable means would have soothed away many of Mrs. Bennet's tears, but to imagine them united to husbands of ample income and substantial property was for her a joy undimmed by frequent contemplation. Nothing made her happier than to think of them in possession of elegant houses and rolling parkland, certain of never hearing the dreaded word entail again. She was aware, of course, that wealthy men in want of wives were not easy to find, and harder still to catch, especially by girls without large dowries. But she was undaunted. Her daughters, she believed, possessed an advantage that would enable them to triumph over all difficulties. Other girls might be rich, but her daughters were beautiful. This, she was sure, was the blessing that would deliver them into wealth. Their looks would attract men of the first eligibility, dazzling their eyes, winning their hearts, and persuading them to ignore the promptings of cold, mercenary common sense. It was for Mrs. Bennet an article of faith that, in the absence of £10,000 in the hand, a pretty face was the single most valuable asset a young woman could possess. Her own experience confirmed her opinion, for, some 25 years before, it had been Mrs. Bennet's youthful beauty which had swept a besotted Mr. Bennet to the altar, overcoming all obstacles that appeared to stand in the way of their union. As he gazed on her handsome face, it had meant nothing to him that her father was merely a country attorney who kept an office in Meryton, or that her brother lived within sight of his own warehouses in Cheapside. He had been determined to marry her, and against all advice to the contrary, he had done so. On the whole, Mrs. Bennet considered herself well satisfied with the outcome. It was true that Mr. Bennet was a whimsical man who teased her more than she thought proper, but as mistress of Longbourn, she presided over a property large enough to gratify her vanity, while her husband's rank assured her the pleasure of patronising her less fortunate acquaintances on every possible occasion. For Mr. Bennet, however, the benefits of his marriage were far less apparent. His failure to consider whether his